Welcome to Cold North Stories, the place where forgotten history finds its voice, where the past is not softened and the truth is never hidden. Every story you hear on this channel is more than just a tale from another time. It is a reminder of what humanity has endured and what it must never repeat. Today's story takes us into a chapter of history that few dare to speak about, a chapter that challenges what we think we know about slavery, power, and suffering. This is not a story meant to divide, it is a story meant to awaken understanding, because history is not always comfortable, but it is always important. This is the truth about the white slave trade, a forgotten history the world needs to remember. Most people grow up with a very narrow understanding of slavery, believing it belonged to one place, one race, and one chapter of history. But the truth is far more complex and far more uncomfortable, because slavery has worn many faces across time, geography, and culture, and one of the most forgotten and controversial of these faces is the story often called the white slave trade, a history that challenges simple narratives and forces us to confront how human cruelty has never been limited by skin color or borders, long before modern nations were formed and long before the Atlantic slave trade reached its peak. Millions of Europeans lived in constant fear of capture, displacement, and forced labor, especially along the coasts of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, where raiders from North Africa and the Ottoman world regularly attacked villages, towns, and ships, dragging men, women, and children away from their homes to be sold in foreign markets. These people were not soldiers in a war. They were fishermen, farmers, mothers, and young children whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and once taken, they vanished from their communities forever, leaving behind families who often never knew what happened to them. This reality is rarely mentioned in classrooms or popular history, not because it did not happen, but because it does not fit neatly into the stories societies later chose to tell about themselves. History, after all, is not only shaped by facts, but also by memory, politics, and power, and over time certain truths become uncomfortable, inconvenient, or too complicated for simple lessons, so they are quietly pushed aside. When people today hear the term slavery, they almost immediately think of the transatlantic slave trade and the brutal enslavement of Africans in the Americas, and that history is absolutely real, devastating, and deserving of remembrance. But what often gets lost is that slavery was not a one-directional crime committed by one group against another. It was a global system of exploitation that changed shape depending on time and place. In medieval and early modern Europe, slavery was already fading in some regions, but forced servitude and human trafficking were thriving elsewhere, especially in areas controlled by empires that relied on captured labor to fuel their economies and militaries. The Barbary coast of North Africa became one of the most infamous centers of this trade, with cities like Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli operating as major hubs where captives from Europe were bought and sold. Historians estimate that over several centuries, more than 1 million Europeans may have been enslaved in this system, though exact numbers are impossible to confirm because many records were lost or never kept. What is certain, however, is that the fear of being taken by slave raiders shaped daily life in many European coastal communities. Entire villages were abandoned, watchtowers were built, and bells were used as early warning systems to alert people of approaching danger. Yet even with these precautions, thousands were still captured every year, dragged onto ships and transported to lands they had never seen, where they were stripped of their names, their language, and their freedom. For those who survived the journey, life in captivity was harsh and uncertain. Some were forced to work in quarries, shipyards, or farms, others were kept as household servants, and some were even sold multiple times, moving from owner to owner like property rather than human beings. Families were separated, children grew up without knowing their parents, and many captives were pressured to abandon their faith and culture to survive. A few managed to earn their freedom through ransom or escape, but most never returned home, their stories fading into silence as the years passed. What makes this history even more tragic is how completely it disappeared from popular memory. While African slavery in the Americas became a defining moral and political issue in the modern world, the suffering of European slaves in North Africa and the Middle East slowly became a footnote, mentioned only in specialized history books and academic circles. Part of the reason for this forgetting lies in how nations build their identities. European countries that later positioned themselves as champions of freedom and human rights found it uncomfortable to remember a time when their own people were powerless. By C. Timms in Foreign Lands, and for countries in the Muslim world, this chapter also became difficult to discuss openly as modern values began to clash with historical realities, so both sides, in different ways, allowed this story to fade, leaving behind a simplified version of slavery that did not reflect its true global scope. Another reason this history vanished is because it complicates moral categories. It challenges the idea that oppression always flows in one direction and forces us to accept that human beings, regardless of culture or religion, have the capacity to exploit others when given the chance. This does not excuse any form of slavery, past or present, but it does reveal something uncomfortable about human nature, that systems of power, not skin color, are often what determine who becomes the oppressor and who becomes the victim. When people today hear about the white slave trade, reactions are often emotional and divided. Some fear that talking about it will be used to minimize the horrors of African slavery, while others feel that ignoring it creates an incomplete and dishonest picture of history. The truth is that acknowledging one does not erase the other. Remembering European slaves does not take away from the suffering of Africans, just as remembering African slaves does not deny the pain of Europeans. History is not a competition of suffering. It is a record of human behavior, and if we want to truly understand the past, we must be willing to face all of even the parts that make us uncomfortable or challenge our assumptions. The forgotten story of white slavery is not meant to rewrite history but to complete it, to remind us that the institution of slavery was a global crime that touched every corner of the world and every type of people. When we reduce it to a single narrative, we lose the chance to learn its deeper lessons. We miss the opportunity to see patterns of exploitation repeating across centuries. We fail to recognize how easily fear, greed, and power can turn ordinary people into participants in cruelty. And perhaps most importantly, we lose empathy for victims whose suffering does not fit neatly into modern political conversations. The past does not belong to any one group, and neither does pain. Every generation inherits the responsibility to look at history honestly, not selectively. And that means telling stories that are uncomfortable as well as familiar. The truth about the white slave trade is one of those stories, buried not because it lacked importance, but because it did not fit the simple moral framework societies later preferred. Yet today, as the world struggles with new forms of human trafficking, forced labor, and exploitation, this forgotten history suddenly feels very relevant again. It reminds us that slavery did not end with chains and ships. It only changed its shape, and that as long as there are vulnerable people and those willing to profit from them, the danger remains. By bringing this hidden chapter back into the light, we are not trying to shift blame or rewrite the past. We are trying to understand it fully, because only a complete understanding of history can help us build a future where no group, no matter their race, religion, or nationality, is ever reduced to property again. When people hear the phrase white slaves, many immediately feel confused or even uncomfortable because it challenges the way slavery is usually taught and understood. Yet the reality is that throughout history, countless Europeans were forced into bondage under conditions that were every bit as cruel and dehumanizing as any other form of slavery. These individuals were not powerful or privileged people. They were mostly the poor, the powerless, and the forgotten. Fishermen who sailed too close to dangerous waters, farmers whose villages lay along vulnerable coastlines, travelers who trusted the wrong road, and children who happened to be born into families without the means to protect them. In a world before strong national borders and organized protection, ordinary people were easy targets for raiders and traffickers who made a living by turning human lives into profit. Many of these captives came from countries like Italy, Spain, France, Portugal, Ireland, England, and even parts of Eastern Europe, and their stories often began the same way. With sudden violence, fear, and confusion, pirates and raiders would strike coastal towns at dawn, setting fire to homes, killing those resisted, and dragging away anyone they could capture. Entire families could be torn apart in minutes with no chance to say goodbye. And once on board the ships, these captives were packed together in horrible conditions, unsure if they would survive the journey, unsure if they would ever see their homeland again. For many, the voyage itself was a nightmare of hunger, sickness, and despair, but it was only the beginning of a much longer suffering, because once they reached slave markets in North Africa or the Middle East, their lives were no longer their own. They were inspected, priced, and sold like animals, judged by their strength, their age, and sometimes even their appearance. Young men were often valued for hard labor or military service. Women were sold into domestic work or forced into situations no human being should ever endure, and children were treated as investments, raised not for love or education, but for the labor they would one day provide. What makes this history especially painful is that many of these people did not even understand what was happening to them. They did not know the language of their captors, they did not know the laws of the land they had been taken to, and they had no way to defend themselves. All they knew was that their old life was gone forever, and a new life of forced obedience had begun. Some captives were sent to work in brutal conditions, breaking stones in quarries under the burning sun, rowing ships until their hands bled, or building fortifications for empires that would never acknowledge their suffering. Others were placed in households where their fate depended entirely on the personality of their owner. A kind master could mean survival, but a cruel one could mean endless punishment, humiliation, and fear. In every case, their freedom had been taken, and with it their sense of identity. They were no longer known by their real names. Their past did not matter, and their future belonged to someone else. Many were pressured to abandon their religion and culture as a way to fully control them. And while some chose conversion as a path to better treatment or survival, others resisted quietly, holding on to their beliefs in secret as the last piece of who they once were. The emotional toll of this captivity was just as devastating as the physical suffering. Imagine waking up every day in a land where you do not understand the words spoken around you, where every order reminds you that you are owned, and where even hope feels dangerous because it can make the pain of reality harder to bear. Many captives fell into deep despair. Some tried to escape and were punished harshly, and others simply accepted their fate because resistance felt impossible. Yet even in these dark conditions, there were moments of human strength and resilience, stories of captives who learned new skills, who secretly helped one another, who shared what little comfort they could find, and who refused to let their captors fall. To break their spirit, some managed to send messages back home, begging for ransom, and in rare cases, families or religious organizations raised money to bring them back. But for most, rescue was only a distant dream. Many died in captivity, and their names were never recorded, their stories never told, disappearing from history as if they had never existed at all. Another group often forgotten in this story is the people who were not taken by force, but were pushed into slavery by desperation. In times of famine, war, and extreme poverty, some Europeans sold themselves or their children into servitude, believing it was the only way to survive. They did not imagine lifelong bondage. They hoped for temporary work, food, and shelter, but once under the control of traffickers, their situation often became permanent. Contracts meant nothing when power was one-sided, and promises of freedom were easily broken. These people were not criminals. They were victims of a world where survival sometimes required choices that led straight into exploitation, and just like those captured in raids, they too became invisible in the grand story of history, because their suffering did not fit the heroic narratives nations preferred to tell about themselves. When we look closely at who the white slaves really were, we see a pattern that repeats across all forms of slavery. The victims were not defined by race, but by vulnerability. They were the ones without armies to protect them, without wealth to buy their freedom. And without political power to make their suffering matter on a global stage, they were ordinary people living ordinary lives until forces beyond their control turned them into property. This is an important truth, because it reminds us that slavery has never been about one group being naturally superior or inferior to another. It has always been about power, about who has it and who does not, about who can take and who cannot resist. When we forget the stories of these white slaves, we do more than erase a chapter of history. We lose a chance to understand how easily any society can fall into patterns of exploitation and how quickly ordinary people can become victims when systems of protection collapse. It also helps explain why some parts of Europe lived in constant fear for centuries, building defenses not against armies, but against slave raiders, why parents warned their children not to wander too far from home, and why entire coastal cultures developed around the fear of sudden capture. These were not exaggerated fears, they were daily realities, and for those who were taken, the world they knew ended in an instant. Their identity as sons, daughters, neighbors, and friends was replaced by a single label, slave, and even after centuries, that loss still matters, because every human story deserves to be remembered, not just the ones that fit modern narratives. Understanding who the white slaves were does not change the horror of African slavery or any other form of bondage. Instead, it deepens our understanding of slavery as a universal human tragedy, showing us that no culture, no religion, and no nation has been free from the temptation to exploit others when given the chance, and no people have been completely safe from becoming victims when power was unbalanced. By remembering these forgotten individuals, we are not trying to rewrite history in favor of one group. We are trying to restore missing voices to the story of humanity, voices that remind us that suffering has never belonged to only one color or one continent, and that the true lesson of slavery is not about division, but about the urgent need for empathy, awareness, and the protection of the vulnerable in every age. Life in captivity for white slaves was a slow, crushing loss of everything that once made them human in their own eyes, because slavery did not only steal their freedom, it stole their identity, their dignity, and their sense of belonging in the world. For many captives, the shock of being taken was so sudden that their minds could hardly process what had happened. One day, they were living ordinary lives in their villages, fishing, farming, raising children, attending church, dreaming of simple futures, and the next day they were chained on a foreign ship, surrounded by strangers who spoke a language they could not understand, headed toward a destiny they could not imagine. That sudden break from normal life created a deep psychological wound, to never fully healed, even for those who survived for many years in bondage, because every memory of home became both a comfort and a source of unbearable pain. Once they arrived in the lands where they would be sold, the reality of captivity became even more brutal. Slave markets were places of fear and humiliation, where human beings were examined like animals, their teeth checked, their muscles touched, their bodies judged for strength and usefulness. Men were often separated from women and children. Families torn apart in seconds, with no chance to say goodbye. Mothers watched their sons taken one way and their daughters another, knowing they might never see them again, and that moment of separation stayed with them forever, because slavery did not just enslave individuals, it destroyed entire families, erasing bloodlines and breaking bonds that could never be restored. After being sold, captives were sent into different forms of labor depending on their age, strength, and perceived value. Some were forced into the hardest physical work imaginable, rowing galleys for hours every day until their hands were raw and their backs permanently bent, working in quarries where stone dust filled their lungs, building walls and fortresses under burning sun with barely enough food to survive. Others were assigned to farms where the work never ended, planting, harvesting, carrying heavy loads from dawn until night, watched closely by overseers who did not hesitate to punish anyone who slowed down. Even a moment of rest could be seen as disobedience, and disobedience often meant beating, isolation, or worse. For those placed in households, life could seem less physically demanding, but it carried its own kind of suffering, because they lived under constant control, never knowing when a simple mistake could lead to punishment. They had to serve every need of their owners, often working from early morning until late at night, cleaning, cooking, caring for children who were not their own, always reminded that they were property, not people. Women in particular faced a special kind of cruelty, because beyond forced labor, many were also forced into situations of sexual exploitation, stripped not only of freedom but of control over their own bodies, a pain that went unspoken in many historical records but left scars that lasted long after captivity ended. Children born into slavery grew up knowing nothing else, their earliest memories shaped by commands, discipline, and fear. They learned quickly that obedience was the only way to survive, and that dreaming of freedom was dangerous because hope could make reality harder to endure. For many captives, the hardest part of life in bondage was not even the physical suffering, but the constant mental struggle to stay human in a system designed to make them feel like nothing. They were often given new names or referred to by numbers, their memories of home dismissed as irrelevant, their culture treated as inferior or meaningless. Over time, some began to forget their native language, their prayers, even the sound of their mother's voice, and that loss of identity created a deep loneliness that no amount of time could heal. Even those who eventually gained their freedom carried that emptiness with them, because the person they had been before slavery no longer existed in the same way. Religion played a complicated role in the lives of many captives. Some were pressured or forced to convert to the faith of their captors as a way to fully break their connection to their past. For a few, this conversion became a path to better treatment or even freedom. But for many it felt like one more loss, one more piece of themselves taken away. Yet others held on to their beliefs in secret, whispering prayers in the dark, using faith as the last place where they still felt free. These small acts of resistance, though invisible to the outside world, were powerful in keeping their spirit alive. Because when everything else is taken, even a hidden prayer can feel like an act of defiance. Despite the cruelty of their situation, stories from this period also reveal moments of unexpected humanity. Some owners treated their slaves with a degree of kindness, allowing them small freedoms, teaching them skills, or even forming strange, unequal relationships that blurred the line between master and servant. But these moments never erased the reality that the slave's life still depended entirely on another person's will. Kindness could turn into cruelty at any time, and trust was always dangerous. Friendships between slaves became one of the few true sources of comfort, people from different countries and backgrounds learning to communicate through broken words and shared suffering, helping each other survive illness, sharing scraps of food, reminding one another that they were still human, even when the world around them treated them as objects. Escape was a dream that lived in many hearts, but it was a dream that came with terrifying risks. For those who tried and failed, the punishment could be brutal. Public beatings meant to serve as a warning to others, chains that made movement almost impossible, or being sold to even harsher owners. Yet some still tried, driven by the simple desire to choose their own fate, and a small number succeeded, disappearing into unfamiliar lands where they had to build new lives from nothing, carrying the trauma of captivity with them every step of the way. For others, the only hope of freedom came through ransom. Religious groups in Europe sometimes raised money to buy back captives. Families sold everything they owned to save a loved one. But this was rare, because most families were too poor to afford such a rescue, and many captives were simply forgotten over time, their disappearance slowly accepted as a tragic mystery that would never be solved. When freedom did come, it did not always bring peace. Former slaves returned home as strangers in their communities, changed by years of suffering, unable to fully explain what they had endured, carrying memories that others could not understand. Some were welcomed as survivors, but others were treated with suspicion, especially if they had converted or adopted customs from their captors, and so even in freedom, they often felt trapped between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The long-term impact of this captivity can be seen in how deeply fear shaped entire generations. In coastal Europe, parents warned their children about raiders the way parents today warn about traffic or crime. Villages built walls and watchtowers, not against armies, but against the constant threat of enslavement. This fear became part of daily life, shaping culture, religion, and even migration patterns. Because for many families, the only way to stay safe was to move inland, far from the sea that brought both opportunity and terror. When we look at life in captivity for these forgotten slaves, we see a story that is not just about chains and labor, but about the destruction of identity, the breaking of families, and the long shadow of trauma that followed people even after they were free. Their suffering may not be as widely remembered as other forms of slavery, but it was no less real and no less devastating. It reminds us that slavery in any form is not just an economic system. It is a deep moral wound that damages everyone it touches. Victims lose their freedom, but societies that allow slavery, why lose part of their humanity? Because every system that treats people as property teaches cruelty, and cruelty always leaves scars that last far longer than the chains themselves. Remembering the lives of these captives is not about reopening old wounds. It is about honoring those who endured in silence, those who lived and died far from home, and those whose names history forgot, because their stories, like all stories of slavery, remind us of a simple truth that remains relevant today, that whenever power is unchecked and human beings are reduced to objects, suffering becomes inevitable. And the cost is paid not just by the victims, but by the soul of humanity itself. The reason this history was buried is not because it lacked importance, but because it was uncomfortable for almost everyone who inherited it, and uncomfortable histories are often the first to disappear when societies decide what stories they want to remember and what stories they prefer to forget. Over time, nations do not just pass down facts, they pass down narratives, simplified versions of the past that support their identity, their pride, and their political goals. And the story of white slavery did not fit neatly into any of those goals. For European countries that later became global powers, admitting that their own people had once been helpless victims in foreign lands did not match the image of strength and dominance they wanted to project. It was easier to remember themselves as explorers, conquerors, and builders of empires than as frightened villagers taken from their homes and sold in distant markets so slowly without any official decision. This part of history faded from school lessons, public memory, and cultural storytelling, while other chapters were repeated again and again until they became the main lens through which slavery was understood. At the same time, in regions where European captives were once held, this history also became difficult to face because modern values of human rights, equality, and dignity stood in sharp contrast to a past that included slavery and human trafficking. Acknowledging that reality required societies to confront their own uncomfortable truths. And many chose silence instead, not necessarily out of denial, but out of a desire to move forward without reopening wounds that might divide people or challenge national unity. Another powerful reason this history disappeared is that it complicates moral storytelling. Human beings prefer simple stories with clear heroes and villains because they are easier to understand and easier to teach. But the reality of slavery across the world does not offer that kind of simplicity. It shows that cruelty is not owned by any one race, religion, or culture, and that power can corrupt anyone. And this is a message that makes people uneasy because it means no group can claim complete moral innocence. When history teachers and writers faced the task of explaining slavery to new generations, many chose a narrower focus, not always out of bad intention, but because limited time and emotional weight pushed them to highlight one major narrative instead of many overlapping ones. And over decades, that narrow focus slowly became the dominant story. While other experiences of slavery, including the enslavement of Europeans, slipped into obscurity, politics also played a major role in shaping what was remembered and what was forgotten. as modern racial issues became central in many countries, especially in the United States. Slavery became tied closely to discussions of race, civil rights, and social justice, and rightly so, because the legacy of African slavery in the Americas continues to affect millions of lives today. But in that process, slavery came to be seen almost entirely through a racial lens, leaving little room for conversations about other forms of bondage that did not fit into that framework. When the idea of white slaves was mentioned, it often felt disruptive, not because it was false, but because it challenged a story that had become deeply connected to identity, activism, and moral responsibility. And in a world where public discussions are already emotionally charged, many people feared that bringing up forgotten histories might be used to distract from present injustices, so instead of being explored carefully and honestly, the topic was often avoided altogether. Another reason this history was buried is the lack of surviving voices. African slavery in the Americas produced powerful first-hand narratives, letters, speeches, and later recorded histories that kept the memory alive. But many European captives who were enslaved abroad never returned home, and those who did often lacked the platform to share their stories widely. Some were illiterate, others were traumatized and silent, and many lived in times when the voices of ordinary people were rarely preserved. Without books, interviews, or famous leaders to carry their experiences forward, their suffering slowly disappeared into the shadows of history, remembered only in local legends or dusty archives that few people ever read. And when a story has no strong voice, it becomes easy to forget, especially when forgetting feels more comfortable than remembering. Social attitudes also contributed to the silence. In many European societies, being captured and enslaved was seen not only as tragic, but also as shameful. Returning captives were sometimes viewed with suspicion, especially if they had adopted foreign customs or religions to survive. Instead of being celebrated as survivors, they were often treated as reminders of weakness. And in cultures that valued honor and strength, this made people reluctant to talk about what had happened to them. Families sometimes chose not to speak of lost relatives, and over generations those silences became permanent gaps in memory. Even churches and religious institutions, which sometimes helped ransom captives, did not always preserve records of their efforts, focusing instead on spiritual missions rather than historical documentation. So when later historians tried to piece together the full story, they found fragments instead of a complete picture. Another powerful force that buried this history was the rise of nationalism. As nations in Europe began to define themselves more clearly, they shaped history to serve those identities. Stories that showed their people as victims of foreign powers were less useful than stories that highlighted bravery, resistance, and triumph. It was easier to teach children about heroic battles than about helpless captives, and over time, national pride reshaped memory until the uncomfortable parts faded away. Even in literature and art, the theme of white slavery appeared only occasionally, often romanticized or exaggerated in ways that turned real suffering into dramatic entertainment rather than serious history, which further distorted public understanding and made it harder to see the truth behind the stories. Modern media has also played a role in continuing this silence. Films, documentaries, and books tend to follow the narratives audiences already recognize, and because the story of white slavery is not widely known, creators often avoid it, fearing controversy, misunderstanding, or backlash. In a world driven by clicks and ratings, complex and sensitive history is harder to sell than clear moral stories. So once again, this chapter remains on the margins, known mostly to scholars and rarely discussed in mainstream conversations. Fear of misuse is another major reason this history stays buried. Many people worry that talking about white slaves will be used by some to downplay or deny the horrors of African slavery. And this fear is not entirely unfounded, because history can be manipulated for political or ideological purposes. But the solution to misuse is not silence. It is honest education. When people are given the full picture, They are less likely to fall for distorted versions of the past. Hiding history creates the very vacuum in which misinformation grows. And yet, out of concern for present struggles, many educators and leaders have chosen to avoid this topic rather than risk it being misunderstood, which has kept it locked away from public awareness. There is also a deeper psychological reason this history was buried. It challenges the way people like to see themselves and their ancestors. Most societies prefer to believe that they stand on the right side of history, that their forefathers were either heroes or victims, not both, and the story of white slavery blurs that comfort because it shows that people can be victims in one era and oppressors in another, that suffering does not make anyone morally superior, and that power, when shifted, can turn yesterday's victim into today's ruler. This idea is deeply unsettling because it forces us to see history not as a simple battle between good and evil, but as a complex web of human behavior where circumstances, fear, and opportunity shape actions in ways that are often uncomfortable to admit. In many ways, the burial of this history reveals more about the present than the past. It shows how selective memory shapes identity, how societies choose stories that support their values, and how difficult it is to face truths that challenge emotional and political comfort. But burying history does not erase it. It only delays the moment when we must finally confront it. And that moment always comes, because the past has a way of resurfacing through forgotten documents, new research, or the simple curiosity of people who sense that the story they were told is incomplete. Today, as conversations about history become more open and more global, the silence around the white slave trade is beginning to break, not to rewrite the past or compete with other histories of suffering, but to complete the picture. Because a world that only remembers selective pain cannot fully understand injustice, and a society that only teaches convenient history cannot prepare future generations to recognize cruelty when it appears in new forms. The truth is that this history was buried not by one decision, one government, or one group, but by centuries of silence shaped by pride, fear, politics, and the human desire for simple stories. And now, as we begin to unearth it, we are not just recovering forgotten victims, we are learning something deeper about ourselves, about how silly we forget what makes us uncomfortable, and how important it is to remember everything, not just the parts that fit neatly into who we want to believe we are. Remembering all victims of slavery means choosing truth over comfort, even when that truth forces us to rethink everything we thought we understood about history. Because slavery was never a single story with one face or one direction, it was a worldwide system of exploitation that crossed borders, cultures, and centuries, and every human being who suffered under it deserves to be remembered with the same dignity and seriousness. When we only honor some victims and forget others, we do not just distort the past, we weaken our ability to recognize injustice in the present, because selective memory teaches us to care conditionally, and real justice can never grow from conditional empathy. The deeper lesson of slavery is not about who suffered more or whose pain matters most. It is about the terrifying truth that human beings, when given power over others, often use it to exploit, and when stripped of protection, any group can become vulnerable. Remembering all victims means understanding that suffering does not belong to one color, one nation, or one religion. It belongs to humanity, and that realization should not divide us. It should unite us in a shared responsibility to prevent history from repeating itself. For too long, conversations about slavery have been shaped by competition rather than compassion, with errant groups feeling the need to defend their pain, as if recognition were a limited resource. But memory is not something that runs out. Honoring one story does not erase another, and acknowledging forgotten victims does not weaken the importance of those already remembered. Instead, it strengthens the moral foundation of history by making it honest, because a truthful history is one that does not hide inconvenient facts or uncomfortable realities. It is one that faces the full scope of human cruelty and human endurance. when we remember European slaves taken to foreign lands, African slaves forced across oceans, indigenous people enslaved in their own homelands, and countless others whose names never made it into books, we begin to see slavery not as a chapter belonging to one people, but as a dark thread running through the story of civilization itself. And that perspective changes everything. It shifts the focus from blame to responsibility, from division to understanding, and from guilt to awareness. Because the goal of remembering is not to accuse the living for the crimes of the dead, but to learn from those crimes so they are never repeated. The danger of forgetting or minimizing any group's suffering is that it creates blind spots. And blind spots are exactly where injustice hides. Today, slavery still exists, not in the same form as chains and auctions, but in human trafficking, forced labor, child exploitation, and modern systems that trap people in cycles of abuse. When we limit our understanding of slavery to a single historical image, we risk missing these realities, because exploitation today does not always look like exploitation did centuries ago. But the pattern is the same: vulnerable people, powerful interests, and a world that often looks away. Remembering all victims of slavery trains our moral vision to see these patterns clearly, to recognize that the face of a victim can belong to anyone, and that the duty to protect belongs to everyone. Another powerful reason to remember every story is that it restores humanity to those who were stripped of it. Slavery works by turning people into objects, and forgetting continues that process in a quieter way. When a victim is erased from history, it is as if their suffering never mattered, as if their life was too small or too inconvenient to deserve remembrance. But every person who lived and died in bondage carried dreams, fears, and love, just like anyone else. They were sons and daughters, parents and friends, people who laughed, hoped, and imagined futures that were stolen from them. Remembering them is not just an academic act. It is a moral one. It says that no life is too insignificant to be honored, and no suffering too minor to matter. When societies choose to remember all victims, they send a message to future generations that human dignity is not selective, that empathy is not reserved for those who fit certain narratives, and that justice is not owned by any one group. This kind of remembrance also helps heal divisions, because it replaces competition with connection. Instead of asking whose pain matters more, we begin to ask how we can prevent pain from happening again, and that shift is powerful. It turns history from a battlefield of identities into a classroom of shared lessons. One of the most important of those lessons is humility. Remembering all victims reminds us that no culture has been immune to cruelty, and no society has been perfectly just. This is not a message of shame, but of honesty, because humility is the foundation of growth. When we accept that our ancestors, like all humans, were capable of both kindness and cruelty, we become more careful with the power we hold today. We become more aware of how easily good intentions can turn into harmful actions when unchecked, and we become more willing to question systems that place profit, control, or ideology above human life. The story of slavery in all its forms teaches us that progress is not guaranteed, that civilization can move forward in technology while moving backward in morality, and that freedom must be protected constantly, not assumed. Remembering all victims also gives voice to the silenced, and silence has always been one of slavery's greatest allies. When people suffer in isolation, when their stories are not told, injustice grows stronger. But when stories are shared, when forgotten lives are brought back into memory, power shifts, because awareness is the first step toward change. This is why remembrance matters not only for the past, but for the future. It shapes the values we pass down, the kind of world we want to build, and the way we treat those who are vulnerable today. Children who grow up learning a complete history, one that includes all victims of oppression, are more likely to develop empathy that crosses boundaries. They are less likely to see the world in simple categories of us and them, and more likely to recognize shared humanity. That is the kind of education that does more than inform. It transforms. It creates citizens who are not just proud of their heritage, but responsible with their power, and compassionate toward others. Remembering all victims of slavery also challenges us to move beyond symbolic gestures and toward real action. Because memory without responsibility is empty. Honoring the past should push us to confront the present, to ask hard questions about labor practices, migration policies, and economic systems that still exploit the weak. It should make us uncomfortable with indifference and impatient with excuses, because once we truly understand what slavery has done to humanity in all its forms, we can no longer pretend that exploitation is someone else's problem. It becomes everyone's concern. The final truth is that remembering all victims of slavery is not about the past alone. It is about the kind of future we choose to create, a future where history is not used to divide, but to unite, not to compete, but to teach, not to justify hatred, but to inspire compassion. When we honor every story of suffering, we build a moral foundation that is strong enough to support real justice. And in doing so, we turn memory into something powerful, not a weapon, but a bridge, connecting different histories, different people, and different experiences into one shared commitment that no human being anywhere in the world should ever again be treated as property, forgotten as a statistic, or silenced by history. If this story made you think, if it changed the way you see history, then its purpose has already been fulfilled. Because real stories are not meant to entertain only, they are meant to stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Here on Cold North Stories, we believe that every forgotten voice deserves to be heard, and every hidden truth deserves to be told. If you want to continue this journey into the real, untold past, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that history tried to erase. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And remember, the coldest stories often carry the deepest truths.